Joining us now is Djene Bajalan. He's a professor of history at Missouri State University. Djene, got an echo.
I don't know what's happening. There we go.
Okay. Djene, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. It's good to speak to you. I hope it's sad that we have to speak under such unfortunate circumstances at the moment.
Well, that was actually, maybe we'll start just with a little bit of an update. I mean, obviously, this has been catastrophic. You know, we have this assassination, this major escalation by Trump, then a, very calibrated response. And then look, additional sanctions against Iran are obviously going to be terrible for the Iranian people. But it did seem to me that a very slurry and kind of oddly sedated Trump, stood down a bit yesterday. And now we have, some Republican senators at least beating up on the security briefings here. So do you think that, look, obviously this is all incredibly dangerous, and taking this course of action is, mind-bogglingly reckless and stupid, and part of a much bigger set of problems, which we'll talk about in a minute. But do things seem to be a bit cooled, relatively speaking, to you?
I certainly think things have cooled down a little bit. It was a stressful night for, everybody who's both, interested in the Middle East and has family or friends in the Middle East. The other day when we had the Iranian counterstrike with those missiles, it was very stressful for people in Iraq who've already gone through, so much over the last decade and a half. So, it seems that we have once again stepped back from the brink. If you remember, a couple of months back, we had that scare with following the downing of the U.S. drone. But, this is just an unending this is just sort of a continuing cycle where we see a ramp up to war, then a step back. And, this is extremely dangerous because, sometimes things can get out of control. Accidents do happen. And, when people, even if people don't intend to get us dragged into a war, things could escalate escalate in such a way that conflict picks up and becomes not inevitable, but conflict picks up and breaks out without people really intending that. I don't think Donald Trump really wants to get into a full-scale war with Iran. I think there are certainly people around him who do. You have, Pompeo, you have Pence, and you have other neoconservative figures who have long wanted to attack Iran. But I think Trump's instinct is to avoid that kind of conflict. But, Trump is a relatively incoherent president, so it's very difficult to predict, which way he's going to go.
Let's go back to 1953. We've talked about this sort of thing in so many different forums, and I think people have a rough sense. But I think it would be great to just have a very clear crash course here on the scale. If we take it back even further than that, there's obviously a lot of British interference, and there's many colonial powers playing colonial games. But specifically, the U.S. relationship with Iran. Can you give us a kind of crash course of the different flashpoints here, going back to the 1953 CIA coup that removed Mossadegh, and what Mossadegh, let's actually really start there. What was Mossadegh trying to do, and why is this event that is most Americans probably have no idea about, why is this is still a core part of the Iranian story?
Yeah, so basically what happened in the early 1950s is that Mohammad Mossadegh came to power in Iran as the prime minister. And Mossadegh was, often he's portrayed as being a communist or a communist sympathizer, but he was no communist. He was a nationalist. He was a veteran member of the Iranian parliament. There had been a revolution in Iran in 1906, and he was an early member of that parliament who sort of had a long history of parliamentary activities. And, as a senior statesman, he eventually came to power with a plan to nationalize Iran's oil. And at that time, basically Iran's oil was under the control of Britain. So 1953 is an interesting point because it's kind of a period in which we not only do we see America ramping up its intervention into Iran, but we also see the decline of the British Empire. If I might take things back a little bit further,
Please.
during the 19th century, we see the origins of the modern Iranian state, and the reform movement in the 19th century was a relatively lethargic one in Iran. The ruling Qajar dynasty, rather than sort of attempting to centralize power vigorously, generally sought to extract money by selling off the country's natural resources. So you have attempts to sell off things such as you have a huge concession given called the Reuters concession. Then you have a tobacco concession, which leads to protests. And then you have the Diachi concession in the early 20th century, which lays the foundation for the formation of Anglo-Iranian oil, which became British Petroleum, and which really took over the Iranian oil industry. So basically, we have this history of Britain and also Russia during the 19th century, basically collaborating with the ruling family and the ruling government of Iran to, take control of Iran's resources. Now, in 1906, there was a constitutional revolution, as I mentioned. And one of the interesting sort of ironies of history is that, crushed between Russian and British imperialism, the constitutionalists who came to power after this revolution, which was eventually crushed by Russia and Britain, looked to the United States as a kind of third power that could perhaps, assist them in gaining independence. And we have William Morgan Schuster being dispatched to the country, trying to help the constitutional regime to sort of reform itself and resist British and Russian imperialism. This obviously failed. And, Schuster, who became obviously well known in the publishing industry in the United States, wrote a book called The Strangling of Persia, where he sees how these imperial powers sort of, were stymieing any kind of reform in the country. Now, fast forward to after the First World War, Britain attempts to impose a protectorate over the country. This doesn't quite work out, but, they back Reza Shah, who overthrows the Qajar dynasty and really begins the process of centralizing power in the state, creating the modern Iranian state. Over the course of the 20th century, no country changed, perhaps other than Saudi Arabia, as much as Iran. Iran was a relatively decentralized state before, at the beginning of the 20th century. By the 1970s, it was one of the most modern and advanced states in the Middle East. So they back Reza Shah. He begins this process of centralization. But during the Second World War, the Shah attempts to balance British and Soviet influence by looking towards Nazi Germany. And again, during the context of the Second World War, this is unacceptable. Britain and the Soviet Union invade and partition the country during the course of the war. Following the end of the war, the Soviet Union attempts to annex the Azerbaijan region of Iran. There's, Soviet Azerbaijan and Iranian Azerbaijan. The Soviets occupy that region during the war and attempt to bring that into the Soviet Union. But of course, they are stopped by, the threat of the United States, which at that point possessed the nuclear bomb, whereas Stalin did not possess the nuclear bomb. But Iranian state during the Second World War is that you have the emergence of kind of democracy. Mohammad Reza Shah is basically placed onto the Iranian throne, and he's a relatively weak character at the beginning of things. And in the place, we see the Mejlis, the parliament, increase in power, and this culminates in the early 50s with Mossadegh, who, like I said, is not a communist, but is a nationalist seeking to take control of Iran's natural resources. Iranians were tired of having their natural resources benefiting foreign multinational companies like Anglo-Iranian Oil, BP, and basically Mossadegh attempted to sort of do something about that. And this, of course, distressed the British Empire, which was, increasingly in a difficult economic position. The war had bankrupted the empire. So, control of the Iranian oil industry was extremely important for the British. And what happens basically is the crisis between Britain and the Iranians gets worse and worse. And the British basically convinced the Americans that, Mossadegh is a communist stooge, and we see the United States and Britain together working to overthrow this government, which ultimately there's an intelligence operation, Operation Ajax, and, the elected Prime Minister of Iran is captured, and the Shah is, basically, who had briefly fled the country, basically installed in power as a dictator. And from this point over, we see sort of British influence declining, and the United States becoming the primary imperial power, primary backer of the Shah's regime. So, this is an important transition point.
Yeah, and maybe then we could, move towards the 70s, but just briefly, I mean, the Shah is just kind of what people would expect. I mean, incredibly brutal. There's a really vicious internal intelligence service, suppression, very big income inequality. There's also, and I think this is an important distinction for people to make, again, we're not talking about, we don't want a religious state. That wouldn't be our political preference, obviously. But, you're talking about a lot of what is not really deep secular politics. It's just sort of attacking religion basically as another agent of kind of class suppression. But also because, of the destruction of civil society, the mosque is actually one of the only places where there's still some actual ability for people to meet and sort of discuss politics and things like that without complete oversight. And then the other thing that I think is maybe also important to touch on is it isn't just that, it isn't just sort of like, okay, this is a Western-oriented U.S. backed dictator in an oil-rich place. The Shah, in this period, there's a partnership that's developed in the intelligence services connecting the CIA, the Israeli intelligence, Turkish, and Iranian. So this is a very active agent of U.S. interest and intelligence operations in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for people, often, on the left, or at least some elements on the left, get a little bit lazy when talking about interest, whereas, everybody is a puppet of the U.S. But of course, the Shah had his own particular interests, which he followed. Internally, this meant centralizing power, continuing the centralization of politics in Iran, this nation-building process, which his father had, begun in earnest in the 1920s. And this, as you rightly point out, means the destruction of civil society, a process which, really took off in the 1960s following the what was known as the White Revolution, an attempt to kind of like modernize Iran at breakneck speed, to co-opt sort of socially liberal or Western-looking kind of facing elites into the society and sort of drag Iran into kind of what the Shah viewed as being an appropriate form of modernity, which included a rejection of the Islamic past in many ways. So he continued that process, which eventually led to the fact that the mosque remained this last bastion of semi-independent civil society from the Shah and an important center of opposition. This was not a new thing. The role of the ulama, the clerics of the cleric scholars of Shia Islam goes back to the 19th century. They were critical in the protests of the 1890s, which reversed the tobacco concession. They were critical in the constitutional revolution period. So, the mosque has played an important role. It, didn't come out of nowhere. In the 1970s, important node of opposition to imperial and Shah and royal power in Iran. Externally, the Shah also had his own interest, which was, of course, to assert Iranian primacy over the Middle East. And this is actually a continuity with the Islamic Republic. The difference being that the Shah generally sought to advance Iran's foreign policy interests in concert with the United States, using through common opposition to the Soviet Union, through anti-communism, basically within the context of the Cold War, which meant relinquishing Iran's claims over Bahrain in the early 1970s, making an agreement with Saddam Hussein of Iraq in 1975, helping the Omanis defeat left-wing insurgents in their country, and supporting what the Americans viewed as moderate leaders across the Middle East, from Jordan to Libya. In fact, the Shah's influence extended even beyond the Middle East. When the dictatorship in Spain fell, the Shah supported right-wing forces to avoid a complete left-wing takeover of Spanish politics. He provided money to them to support the royal family. So, this is the Shah played had his own interests, and of course these were in concert with in many ways were in concert with Iran.
So then talk with the U.S. Yeah. So talk about then, I guess the revolution. How it maybe briefly how a kind of multi-factional revolution turns into a Islamic one. And to be really clear, there was always obviously a major role. The Ayatollah, the Muslim forces were incredibly important in this revolution, but there was also a left, there was also a liberal faction who ended up being marginalized. And then maybe through then, can you take us, and then of course there's the hostage crisis, which is obviously a violation and an enduring sense of massive grievance. It seems to me, even in the main, for people who actually weren't the victims of it. A lot of the people who actually went through this horrible experience seem to have much more sort of thoughtful and interesting takes on what that relationship could be. And then in the 1980s, maybe specifically, because I think the other major event is obviously the Iran-Iraq War, and then having the United States and other major players in the West be supplying Saddam Hussein while he attacks Iran with chemical weapons.
Yeah, I mean, so if we look at the context of the revolution, it's often called an Islamic revolution. Of course, Islam is important in that revolution, as you know. But it's a nationalist revolution in many ways. Islam becomes an important symbolic resource for the nationalists to mobilize to sort of build a sort of an Iranian identity that separates itself from the sort of secular pre-Islamic Iranian identity promoted by the Shah and his followers. So, of course, because of the dictatorship of the Shah, we see a radicalization in Iranian politics, which hollows out the sort of liberal reformist center, and we see communists and Islamists increasingly becoming powerful in the country. And, of course, the U.S., with its support for the regime, as well as important symbolic issues such as the extraterritorial rights that Americans enjoyed in Iran, which was seen as a big violation of Iranian sovereignty. All these things helped, created a tinderbox, which the country was ready to explode. So we see in the late 1970s. The Iranian economy, basically, the Iranian regime had been sort of sustained by sort of economic success in the 60s and 70s, growth, wage growth, but eventually, we have an overheating of the Iranian economy. We have, inflation. We have, we have a sort of massive movement of rural population into the cities, which is exacerbated by the Shah's policies, and this creates a crisis which, eventually overthrows the regime in 1979, and we have basically coming to the fore, left-wing forces and Islamist forces cooperating, and once the Shah leaves in 79, we see sort of this process by which, fall post-revolution, there is, from the left-wing perspective, a counter-revolution in which conservative forces that had been allied with the left, and, we can also talk about the strategic mistakes made by the Iranian left, which many Iranian leftists backed Khomeini, seeing him as being, potentially a weak figurehead for the revolution. But when he got into power, of course, he very quickly began to consolidate power. And
just as a interjection, I talked to someone who was involved very significantly, actually held an ambassadorial role in the first revolutionary government. And this is somebody who's, Iranian, completely secular, I would say a social democrat sort of politics. And he said, yeah, I absolutely, I thought that in the same way that the Congress Party in India had Gandhi, and of course there was this, Hindu and spiritual dimension, but he's like, I thought the Ayatollah was totally an analogous figure. And of course Gandhi was a very shrewd politician too, but he was also a Democrat, for his flaws. And I think, yeah, that just to underline that people really did have a sense of the Ayatollah as some type of, maybe with greater or lesser degrees of power, but some type of kind of moral sort of organizing force or figurehead, and not this actually really effective kind of brutal Machiavellian character that he turns out to be.
Yeah, I mean, the only group in Iran that, sort of recognized the danger of Khomeini and the Islamists were the Kurdish movement, because, of course, they weren't Shia. So, a lot of the Shia ideology was seen very threatening. So we see, the first major suppression after the revolution takes place in Kurdistan, which is important to note because many of the figures in the regime, including Qasem Soleimani, but also including reformists, like Jalilpur, who these young men in their 20s were sent to Kurdistan to, crush the pro-autonomy movement there. So, there were groups that opposed it, but in general, sort of people rallied behind the regime. And when when the Iran-Iraq War broke out, this provided further impetus to sort of crush any oppositional forces. So in the early 80s, we see, widespread suppression of the left, and really the extermination of an entire generation of the Iranian left who are either killed or flee to Europe and the United States. So this is an important thing to understand about the. We see a revolution being sort of taken over by right-wing political forces very soon after the fall of the regime.
Then in the 1980s, though, it's very important to, let's cover the Iran-Iraq War and the U.S. role in it.
Sure. I mean, before I get to the Iran-Iraq War, I just want to note the Reagan administration, in many ways came to power thanks to the hardliners in the Iranian regime. So, there is always, to some degree, whether sort of conscious or unconscious, some kind of symbiotic relationship between hardliners in Iran and the United States.
Well, and maybe even mention Iran-Contra. I mean, everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we're literally talking about basically part of it is actually the Iranians basically saying, if we have plausible deniability, we'll take arms from Israel, and then the United States are basically illegally funneling weapons to the Iranians during this war as well, so they can fund their, death squads that they're backing across Latin America, which Congress had cut funding off for. So yes, there's always seems to be on a subconscious level, the right-wing politics are synchronized.
Yeah, exactly. So we see the Americans and the Soviet Union backing the Iraqis in their invasion in the early 1980s. And, the Iraqis act extremely brutally in Iran, and, this invasion actually helps consolidate a hardline regime. And the war basically goes on. The United States, for example, continuously sort of supports the Iraqis diplomatically, even after the Iraqis start using chemical weapons against Iranian forces, which is, of course, illegal under international law. So we have, Saddam Hussein, people who are Iraqi regime, which was getting all kinds of plaudits. There's a good picture that always does the rounds at times of crisis with Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein in the mid-1980s. In Iran, they call this it was a war, basically, which many Iranians see as being imposed by the United States. That the Iraqis had their own reasons for invading Iran, but of course, this wouldn't have been possible without a green light from from the United States or the Soviet Union. And the cost to Iranians was enormous. You have the regime consolidating, but you have, hundreds of thousands of people, young Iranians, going to war, and the regime, sending wave after wave of Iranians into combat, including underage kids to defend their country against Iraqi invasion. So, you have this tragic war, which is started by the Iraqis. And when the Iranians get the upper hand, the United States begins to not simply support the Iraqis diplomatically or with credit so that they can buy their Soviet weapons. Interesting thing about the Iraqi army was that, they had a lot of Soviet equipment, they had a lot of French equipment, and, a big hodgepodge of different equipment because, they were backed by both sides of the Cold War in many ways. And so when we get to 1980, when the Iraqi regime is sort of being pushed back, we see the Americans in the spring of 1980 basically sinking the Iranian Navy. There's an operation known as Operation Praying Mantis, which is a response to the Iranians mining the Gulf, and the Americans attack Iranian territorial waters and sink their navy. And this is followed, I think, a month later by the shooting down of an Iranian passenger jet, which, whether or not was deliberate, was seen by the Iranians as being, well, the Americans are willing to take any kind of step to stop us, and sort of eventually forces the two sides to peace, which the Iranians were extremely bitter about because their country had been invaded.
And also, to be really clear, I mean, yes, this is really important. We talked about this yesterday. The United States shoots down a commercial passenger jet. They claim that it was outside of its, its airspace. It was not. And then to make matters, worse, particularly in a look, obviously all of this garbage about, a lot of sort of cultural explanations of actual material politics are, overblown at best and stupid and essentialist at worst, and mostly. But, people everywhere take apologies and symbolism seriously. And so after you blow a civilian jet out of the sky, George Herbert Walker Bush, fighting the wimp factor, says, we don't apologize. So literally, we're going to, at best, by being absolutely reckless, kill a bunch of innocent, citizens, and then just sort of throw salt on it by not apologizing. And I think everybody knows, and this isn't even who cares about it? This isn't even a point about hypocrisy. This is a basic human thing. If somebody blew a U.S. jet out of the air and then basically said, first lied about it and then said, screw you, we would all be rightfully disgusted and angry, just as I can't think of a single country in the world that wouldn't have that response. It's just basic human stuff here. So that's another thing on the kind of Iranian side of the ledger. I know that there's a lot, obviously, that happens. There's things that happened in the 90s, and there's certainly things that happened in the Ahmadinejad era. But because we're in the interest of time, I think the other two things that are really important to hit are the serious potential and very earnest diplomacy under Khatami, which is rejected, most infamously in the David Frum penned Axis of Evil speech. And we're talking about, Khatami, a leader who had, not as much internal, he was a democratically elected president, distrusted by a lot of people in the in the other parts of the Iranian government. So, he might have been undermined, but he seemed to be even more interested in potentially something even more comprehensive and resetting than what came later. And then, of course, let's just talk about that first. I do want to get more current, but talk a little bit about Khatami, who was president from 1997 to 2005, and the very serious outreach that happened from Iran at that time, and how the neocons and the Bush administration chose to respond to that.
Yeah, so, in the 90s, you have this election of what they call reformists in Iran, And I would note the kind of, in my opinion, the primary difference between reformists and hardliners in Iran is actually less on domestic politics and more on, how they interact with the world. And Khazemi, attempted to, improve relations with the United States. And there was a lot of sort of, potential policy overlap between the two, particularly with regards to opposition to Iraq, which emerges during the, following 9/11, as well as Afghanistan. During the 90s, my dad got a satellite dish to watch Kurdish TV. And I used to watch the Iranian news channel sometimes, and they would always refer to the Northern Alliance as the Islamic government of Afghanistan rather than the Taliban. So there were certainly, even after 9/11, there was a very good opportunity to engage based on common foreign policy goals.
Djene, you're cutting out. You're cutting out, Djene.
Sorry.
So I don't know. I mean, you're good. It happens every once in a while. I don't know whether you're moving or not, but now you sound great. So please stay there. Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, so basically you had a lot of potential overlap because the people after 9/11 that the United States were against in Afghanistan were the same ones the Iranians had opposed. And, in the late 90s, the Iranians mobilized military forces on the Afghan border because of the threat of the Taliban. The Iranians had no love for the Iraqi government. So, but we have people like David Frum and the neocons in the Bush administration who basically needlessly undermined the reformists, which paved the way in 2005 for the election of Ahmadinejad. So, this is why people like David Frum, when they're going around acting as, arbiters of the resistance and people who decide to platform them should really be questioned about what they're doing. This guy writing that speech really had, and symbols matter in politics, really had a deleterious effect on stability in the region. And of course, after the war in Iraq takes place, we see the United States and Iran fighting a proxy war in Iraq. And of course, Iraqis are the ones who suffered the most from that. So, the Bush administration is complete unnecessary provoking of Iran, whatever we think about the Iranian regime, and I'm certainly no fan of the Iranian regime, did not really help many people and created, probably exacerbated the violence in Iraq at the cost of many Iraqi lives.
And then we have, the phase we're in now. And I want to just also touch on, I think this is actually really important history. In 2010, President Lula of Brazil actually negotiated a deal that was very similar on the Iranian nuclear weapons program as to what would end up being signed several years later, by President Obama and negotiating partners. And, the view from Brazil and other sort of developing countries involved in this process, Turkey was as well, which I'm very sympathetic to, is that, look, this was actually this was a real deal, and it was very similar, maybe even better in some respects than what would come later. And the reason that it was just sort of rejected out of hand by the West and by Merkel and Obama was essentially just, we can't have players like Brazil negotiating stuff like this. This needs to come from Washington or Berlin. And I think that that's really important history. And I think it's also important to underline because even under Ahmadinejad, there was a willingness in Iran because of its own, again, just like as you say, its own tactical and strategic considerations, its own eyeing of the Middle East, and its own interest to negotiate some sort of deal with the United States. Then we have this Iran deal that, by all accounts, Iran followed closely, and then of course Trump. Is it, in addition to the ideological foundations of all the people around Trump egging on war and conflict, do you think there's also just a real sort of delusion and misreading in the sense that these are the types of people that could hear reports from Iran that people are protesting because people are angry about inequality or social repression or, labor suppression, other real serious problems in Iran. And then they see that as confuse that as they would with some type of desire for an outside coup or invasion. Like, what is the actual, thinking here in the context of that history?
It's a very interesting question. What I find interesting about this assassination that took place recently is the sort of the focus on the individual as being, critical to the functioning of a regime. There's, people familiar with the functioning of the Revolutionary Guard, don't think that the assassination of Qasem Soleimani is going to make a difference. But it reminded me of the initial strike at the beginning of the Iraq War, which was sort of dedicated to assassinating Saddam Hussein, as if you take out one person, you're going to be able to kind of a sort of non-state actor. The taking out of a political leader can have a serious effect on the organization. But when we're dealing with a nation state, with the power of, with the monopoly of violence and the ability to tax, the individual is less important. But it does speak to a kind of worldview that sees individuals as being critical. The joke my wife often makes is like, well, liberals and conservatives often talk about assassinations, when really, if you want to change things, you need a guillotine. It's like it's not about it's not about getting rid of individuals, but I think there are people out there who think that you just take out one person and you'll suddenly solve your problems, which that's not how it works when you have these large bureaucratic structures. So I think it's a kind of weird libertarianism almost in some way that looks at politics as this kind of great man theory. So, you take out the great man. Did the taking out of Osama bin Laden end Islamic terrorism? Has ISIS disappeared since al-Baghdadi was assassinated? Take different examples. The Turkish government arrested Abdullah Öcalan in 1999, and the PKK is still a major force in amongst the Kurds of Turkey, and to some extent in Iraq as well. So it's a kind of worldview which I think is fundamentally misunderstands how political power operates.
So what, just in a more narrow way, and there's so much more to look at. I mean, there's obviously, as you said, the way Iraq is constantly victimized in these dynamics, going back to the U.S. invasion. There's the recklessness of Netanyahu and MBS, and what are the Israeli and Gulf interests, and so on. And then also how this, we talked on my show the other day about how this could be undermining particularly this incredible cross-sectarian movement emerging in Lebanon. But taking it slightly more narrowly, but maybe it touches on those other things I mentioned. I mean, what if, obviously the person who is the most serious about this and has some voting record to match it is Sanders. But, what are the practical things that leadership could do to bring us back here, to the extent any line can be held against Trump. I mean, we have no democratic accountability in foreign policy right now, and small d democratic. So that's one, dealing with an ongoing emergency as long as this idiot is president and the goons around him are empowered. But what would, so that's one part of it. And then the other part, and I'm presuming here, somebody who actually might want to at least attempt some actual reform in U.S. foreign policy and bring us back here, what are the kind of roadmaps of what could actually be done?
It's a difficult question. I mean, I don't mean to sound pessimistic, but, the biggest blow that Trump has done has been to pull out of the Iran deal, right. Not simply because he pulled out of a deal which was limiting Iran's nuclear ambitions. And that's an important thing for everybody, because if Iran gets a nuke, we're going to see Turkey and Saudi Arabia wanting a nuke, and the last thing we need is a nuclearized Middle East.
But Djene, can I ask you...
Who can trust? Who can trust the United States? Well,
right. But can I also just ask you really quickly, I mean, one, it is important to note that there's never any conclusive evidence that Iran was ever weaponizing. That has never been proven. And the second thing is, yes, it would be bad in the broader Middle East, but I mean, What other rational conclusion could Iran get from all of this other than they should have a nuke?
Oh, no, exactly. This is, the lesson is, Kim Jong-un has nuclear weapons.
Right.
Iran does not. And, Kim Jong-un gets the proper treatment. It's entirely rational to want to have a nuclear weapon. Whether or not their program was, there's a lot of debate that they were actually pushing for a nuke is not as conclusive as people in the United States often think it is. But the point is, this exactly goads the Iranians into realizing the need for a nuclear weapon. If you have a nuclear weapon, you're taken seriously, like North Korea is. If you don't have a nuclear weapon, well, your military officials can be assassinated at any moment, and you can be placed under pressure. So you get treated differently in the international circumstances. And the problem is, I'm sure President Sanders would attempt to de-escalate, would try to move back to the Iran nuclear deal, would, perhaps offer some sanction relief. There would be an out, for the Iranian regime. But then the question becomes, U.S. politics has elections. And, what happens if we have, 8 years of Bernie Sanders and then President Tom Cotton or President Ted Cruz? Then, these leaders in the Middle East can't just calculate for the length of a particular administration. So in many ways, I think Trump has done irrevocable damage to the United States' ability to engage in diplomacy across the region.
Well, Djene Bajalan, there you have it. That makes a lot of sense. Actually, Djene, wait, there was one thing you wanted to plug. Is that right?
That is true. That is true. There is a Bernie Sanders watch party taking place in Springfield, Missouri. So if anybody wants to come to see the debate on Tuesday at 7:30, everybody is meeting at the TGI Fridays restaurant, which is 3242 South Stewart Avenue. It's the only TGI Fridays in Springfield. And we'll be watching the debate there. So if, people are in Southwest Missouri and want to watch the debate with everybody, come along.
That's awesome. Djene Bajalan, that's so cool. Djene Bajalan, professor, Missouri State University. Appreciate your time as always, man. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michael. You take care of yourself.